The bunker had been sealed for 11 months before I found her. That detail matters, and I'll tell you why it matters in a moment. First, let me tell you what kind of man I am so you don't go building the wrong picture. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a diplomat or a doctor or anything that gets carved into a stone somewhere. My name is Edrin Saul. I was a maintenance technician, class IV, assigned to subsurface facility KL9 by a company called Orphan Environmental Systems, which is itself owned by a larger company called the Verath Consolidated Health Authority, which is itself a bureaucratic arm of a governing body I won't bother naming because it doesn't exist anymore. I fix things. Air scrubbers, coolant loops, water recycling membranes. The grinding mechanical infrastructure that keeps people alive underground when the surface has been declared unviable. I was good at my job. That's the only credential I'm offering. I want to be clear about what good at my job means in my line of work, because people outside it sometimes have a romantic idea about maintenance technicians, the solitary genius in the crawlspace, diagnosing by intuition, saving the day with a wrench and a knowing look. That's not it. Good at maintenance work means patient, methodical, and honest about what the readings say, even when the readings say something you'd rather they didn't. It means not cutting the seal check short because you're tired. It means going back and rerunning the diagnostic when the numbers look right, but the sound doesn't match. Because sometimes the sound is telling you something the sensors aren't measuring. It means writing the report that reflects what you actually found, not the report that keeps everyone comfortable. It means staying until the job is done. I'd been doing that kind of work for 22 years when Orphan Environmental Systems sent me to KL9. I was 53 years old. I had worked in sealed facilities, in vacuum-adjacent installations, in pressurized underwater habitats, in the kind of environments that were designed to keep hostile conditions outside and human life inside, and the work was always the same at its core. Find what's failing before it fails completely, fix it correctly, document it honestly, and leave the place better than you found it. 22 years. I was very good at it. KL9 was a quarantine facility, originally built to house a research team studying a contagion called the Mureth bloom, a respiratory pathogen, alien in origin, that had arrived on a cargo freighter about 4 years before any of this happened, and had since spread through 3 of the lower settlement corridors of the Verath Collective's outpost on Drenath Station. The bloom didn't kill quickly. It was patient. It worked through the lymph nodes and the bronchial passages in long, slow cycles, and the people it took them over months, not days, which was in some ways worse. KL9 had been built to isolate confirmed cases, study the progression, and eventually, the health authority hoped, develop a suppression protocol. That's what they said anyway. What KL9 actually was, by the time I arrived, was a facility that had already lost its research director, its 2 senior physicians, and 14 of its original 22 patient residents to the bloom itself. It turned out the ventilation seals in the original construction were below specification, a Orphan error, as it happened, which was part of why Orphan sent me rather than anyone more qualified. They needed someone technically competent enough to assess the damage, legally expendable enough that their insurance exposure stayed manageable, and quiet enough that the whole situation didn't become a press problem. I was all 3. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because the kind of place KL9 was sealed, undersupported, already half dead before I got there, is the context in which a small alien child in a ventilation crawlspace makes a certain kind of terrible sense. I arrived via a supply drone drop, which is how you got in and out of KL9 once the biological lockdown protocols were active. The drop pod put me down in the level 2 decon corridor, and a health authority liaison named Supervisor Dast met me through a sealed glass partition and explained, in the flat tone of someone reading a maintenance order rather than describing a catastrophe, that my job was to assess the failed ventilation seals in the original eastern wing, document the scope of the breach, and prepare a formal report for the authorities' legal and remediation teams. I was not, Dast emphasized, to interact with any remaining patient residents. I was not to enter the residential pods. I was to treat the entire facility as a contaminated zone, which it was, and to conduct my work in full hazmat protocol at all times. He handed me a work order through the partition slot and walked away before I could ask him how many remaining patient residents there were. I found out from the facility's own log system, which I accessed from the maintenance terminal on my first morning. 3. There were 3 patient residents still alive in KL9, an older Drenathi male named Sarek, a human woman named Vash who had been a freight coordinator before her diagnosis, and a third entry marked simply as non-classified resident, intake day 203. No name, no species confirmation, just an intake date and a room number, Pod 7, Level 3. I noted it, I moved on. I had seals to assess. The eastern wing ventilation work took me 4 days. The breach was worse than the brief had suggested. 3 of the original junction seals had been installed with the wrong grade polymer gaskets, a manufacturing defect that the original construction team had either missed or documented and ignored. And by now, the cross-contamination pathways ran through nearly a third of the eastern corridor. I documented everything carefully, cross-referenced the installation manifests, and wrote it up in the kind of technical language that would be useful to the lawyers and useless to anyone who actually wanted to understand what had gone wrong. That was the job. On the 5th day, I ran a standard systems diagnostic and found a fault reading in the Level 3 secondary air recycler. Not urgent, it wasn't a contamination pathway, just a mechanical inefficiency. But the air quality in Level 3 was already marginal, and the recycler degradation would eventually tip it into uncomfortable territory for the residents still alive down there. I told myself I was going down for the equipment, which was true. I'm not going to dress it up. Level 3 smelled different from the upper levels. Older, somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with the air chemistry. The lights ran on a dimmer relay. KL9's power management system redistributed load automatically when sections went partially vacant, and the corridors had the particular quality of somewhere that had been alive once and had gradually reduced itself to a quieter frequency. I found the secondary recycler in the junction room at the east end of the level, opened the maintenance panel, and started working. I was 20 minutes into the repair when I heard something in the wall. Not a mechanical sound, not a pipe knock or a pressure flutter, something with irregular rhythm, something alive. I put down my calibration tool and stood very still, the way you learn to stand when you're working on pressurized systems, and a sound doesn't match the system map. The facility's ventilation crawlspace ran behind the junction room wall, a 50-centimeter gap designed for maintenance access, intended for a person, but technically accessible from a grill on the residential corridor side. I went to the wall and I listened. Breathing, shallow, fast but controlled. Something was working at staying quiet. I said in the general direction of the wall, "I can hear you." Nothing for a moment, then a shift of weight on the crawlspace floor. I said, "I'm not the authority, I'm the maintenance tech. I'm fixing the air recycler." I paused. I'd like to fix the air recycler without anyone having a bad time, so if you're in the crawl, you can stay there. I'm not going to report you. I didn't know, at that point, who I was talking to. I assumed it was one of the 3 remaining residents, maybe someone mobile enough to have found the crawlspace, maybe someone who'd been using it to move around the facility outside the monitored corridors. People in locked facilities do resourceful things when the authority isn't looking. I understood that. I went back to the recycler and kept working. About 10 minutes later, the grill at the bottom of the far wall moved, just a few centimeters. I kept my eyes on the recycler housing. I heard the grill come the rest of the way open. I heard the sound of someone, very small, dropping to the floor. I turned around slowly, because fast movements are the enemy of trust, And that's a thing I've always known even before I had a specific reason to know it. She was standing against the wall beside the open grill, and she was watching me with eyes I hadn't seen before on anything living. Not large the way human eyes get large in the dark, large in a different way. The irises pale silver white against the amber gold of her skin, the pupils wide and perfectly still. The gill ridges along her jaw were faintly iridescent blue-green, like oil on water, and they flared slightly with each breath, which I later understood was how her species read the air, tasting chemical information that human senses had no vocabulary for. She was small, waist height, maybe less. She wore what had once been a medical-issue tunic that was now several sizes too big and had been knotted and folded around herself into something roughly functional. She held in both hands a small doll made from rolled bandage material and a piece of electrical wire, something made, not issued, something made with intent. She did not look frightened. That was the first thing that surprised me. She looked like someone who had made a careful calculation and was waiting to see if it came out the right way. I crouched down because you don't stand over small things that have just made a decision to trust you. I said, "Hi." She looked at me for a long time. I let her look. I've learned in maintenance work and everywhere else that the correct response to being assessed carefully is to hold still and let the assessment run. People and things that rush to fill silences with reassurance usually have something to reassure about. I had nothing to reassure about. I was a maintenance technician with a calibration tool and a morning's worth of work to do, and if she needed to look at me until she was satisfied, she could look. She looked for a while. Her gaze moved across my face, my hands, my kit, the recycler, the readouts on the panel, and then back to my face. She was cataloging, reading the available data methodically, the way a careful technician reads a schematic before touching anything. Then she looked at the recycler, then back at me. She pointed at the recycler with one finger. "That's what I'm fixing," I said. "The air quality down here is below spec. I'm getting it back in range." She looked at the recycler again. Then she crossed to it, stopped beside me and watched me work, just like that. No further preamble. She had apparently decided I was acceptable, and the terms of acceptable were that I kept fixing the thing. I fixed the thing. Her name, I learned in pieces over the following days, was Piv. Or that was the sound she used for herself when she said it. Two soft syllables that I couldn't entirely reproduce with human phonology, but that I settled on rendering as Piv in my own head and eventually out loud. She corrected my pronunciation twice, patiently, and then accepted the approximation. She was Kethani, a species from the outer corridor settlements, not numerous, not politically significant by Verath collective standards, and medically distinct from humans in ways that would later become very important. The Murith bloom had arrived at KL9 the way it arrived everywhere, attached to a person who didn't yet know they were carrying it. What I pieced together slowly, from what Piv showed me, and what I found in the facility records when I looked more carefully than my work order required, was this. Piv had arrived at KL9 on day 203 of the facility's operation, listed as a non-classified resident at intake, which meant the health authority had processed her as a potential exposure contact rather than a confirmed case. She had not been assigned a caretaker. She had not, as far as I could tell from the records, been assigned anything. There was an intake form, a room designation, Pod 7, and then nothing. No assessment notes, no treatment plan, no follow-up documentation at all. Just a child in a sealed facility, in a room with a number, in a system where the people who were supposed to be paying attention had started dying before they could. I don't know how long she'd been living in the crawl spaces. When I asked her, she showed me her doll and then held up all her fingers twice. I didn't know if that meant 20 days, or some other count, or something else entirely. What I knew was that she'd been eating. Pod 7 had a food dispensary unit that was still functional, and she'd been accessing it. And she'd been moving through the crawl spaces to access different sections of the facility. And she'd been watching, from behind the grills, the people who moved through the corridors below her. Including, I realized, me. "You were watching me before I heard you," I said. She looked at me without expression. "How long?" She held up 3 fingers. 3 days. She'd been watching me for 3 days before she decided to come down through the grill. I thought about that for a while, what it meant to be watched for 3 days by something small and careful, and without enough reason yet to trust. And I found I didn't have much to say about it except that I was glad she'd made the choice she made. I was glad she dropped out of the wall and stood there with her bandaged doll and her pale silver eyes, and decided I was worth a closer look. I started leaving food near the junction room, not making a production of it, just positioning things, a protein bar, a sealed water packet, a piece of dried fruit from my own rations, on the floor near the recycler before I started work each morning. She never took them while I was watching. They were always gone when I came back. I didn't comment on this. She didn't either. It was an arrangement, not a conversation, and arrangements don't require acknowledgement to function. On the 9th day after I first heard her in the wall, she sat down beside me while I was running a pressure calibration and did not leave for 3 hours. She watched my hands move. She watched the tools. She watched the gauge readings fluctuate and settle. At some point she reached out and touched the calibration unit with 2 careful fingers, not pressing anything, just feeling the casing. I let her. The calibration ran fine. On the 11th day, she showed me something I hadn't found in the records. She led me to a section of level 3 I hadn't needed to access yet, the far western corridor, which had been marked in the facility schematic as a secondary residential block, currently unoccupied. She stopped at a door marked SR12 and looked at me until I opened it. Inside was a child's room. Not a medical room, someone had converted it before the bloom had taken the people who did such things into something softer. A sleeping pad with a real blanket on it, a small shelf with a few objects, a lamp that still worked, the light warm and yellow. On the shelf was a second doll, older than the one Piv carried, made from different materials, something that had been made for her rather than by her. And beside the doll, a folded piece of paper. I looked at Piv, she nodded. I picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was written in the Varath standard script, which I could read, and it said, in handwriting that slanted slightly left the way people write when they're tired. "She doesn't have it. I checked twice. She's clean. Please keep her safe until someone comes who can take her somewhere better than here. Her name is Piv. She likes watching things that work properly. She is very good at being quiet. She is not as frightened as she looks, but she is a little frightened, so please be gentle." No signature. Just those lines, and below them a date, day 206 of Kale 9's operation, 3 days after Piv's intake. I stood there holding the paper for a moment. Then I folded it back the way I'd found it and set it on the shelf. Piv was watching me with her still silver eyes. "I understand," I said. She looked at the doll on the shelf, then at the doll in her hands, then at me. "Okay," I said. "Let's go make sure the water recycler on the North Junction is running properly. I noticed a pressure drop yesterday." She followed me out of the room, and I made sure the door latched behind us. The 3 remaining adult residents of Kale 9 knew about Piv. I should be clear about that. Sarek, the older Drenathi man, was in a late stage of bloom progression and rarely left his pod. He was gentle and very tired, and when I managed a brief conversation with him through his pod's external comm panel, he told me, without being asked, that Piv had been visiting him through the ventilation grill for months. She'd bring him things sometimes, small things, a piece of the dried fruit from the dispensary, a folded piece of foil she'd found somewhere. He said she'd watched him for a long time before she started leaving the things, and that once she started, she never stopped, even after the bloom made it hard for him to get up from his bed. She understood something, Sarek said. Not about the illness, about being in a place that had gotten quiet around you. She knew how to be in the quiet without making it worse. He died on my 14th day in the facility. I found out from the facility's automated vital sign log. I didn't tell Piv. I didn't have to. She already knew. When I came down to level 3 that morning, she was sitting in the junction room with her doll in her lap, and she was very still, and I sat down on the floor beside her, and we stayed there for a while without saying anything. Vash, the freight coordinator, was more mobile. She had a quiet fury about her condition, not self-pity, nothing like that, just an ongoing low-level rage at the administrative incompetence that had put her in KL9, and the administrative indifference that seemed prepared to leave her there until the bloom finished its work. She was the one who had made Piv's room in SR12. She was the one who had written the note. When I knocked on the external comm panel of her pod and told her who I was and what I was there to do, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Have you met her?" I said yes. "Good," Vash said. "She's been waiting for someone to notice." I said I'd noticed. "Not notice like a technician noticing a fault reading," Vash said. "Notice like a person noticing another person." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said I'd noticed like a person. Vash didn't say anything for a while. When she spoke again, her voice had changed register slightly lower, more careful. "She's clean. I want you to understand that. The doctors tested her twice before they died. Cathani biology doesn't express the bloom pathogen. She can't catch it and she can't carry it. She's been in this facility for months and she doesn't have it and she's not going to get it. She shouldn't be here. She should have been released on day 208, which is when the second negative result came back. But the authority had already gone into internal management mode, and nobody was processing releases anymore, and she just stayed. Because there was nowhere to send her and no one left to send her. "I read the records," I said. "Then you understand what I'm asking." I said I did. What she was asking was whether I was going to put PIV on my assessment report, whether I was going to document the non-classified resident in Pod 7 and flag her for the health authority's attention in the way my work order technically required, whether I was going to do the correct administrative thing. I said I'd let her know. I went back to my maintenance terminal, and I sat in front of the work order for a long time. Here is the thing about the Varath Collective's health authority in the years around the Murith Bloom outbreak. The thing that wasn't in the official statements but was very much in the operational culture. The authority had a protocol for situations where quarantine containment was complicated by a subject who tested negative for active infection, but who had been resident in a confirmed high-exposure zone for an extended period. The protocol was called Extended Precautionary Containment. It was designed, nominally, for cases where the incubation period was uncertain and a negative test result couldn't be fully trusted. In practice, EPC meant you stayed in the facility until the authority was ready to process your release, which, in KL9's case, meant you stayed until the lawyers had sorted out the liability questions around the installation defect, which meant you stayed until Dorthan Environmental Systems and the health authority had completed their remediation review, which my supervisor Dast had already told me, in the flat tone of someone reading a maintenance order, could take up to 2 years. 2 years. In a sealed facility where the ventilation was compromised and the air quality was marginal and the other people were dying one by one. Piv was not going to get the bloom. Vash had been right about that. But she was going to spend 2 years alone in a facility that was slowly ceasing to be a place where anything alive was being maintained, and the authority was going to cite EPC, and no one was going to push back because she was a non-classified resident in a case file that nobody wanted to open, because opening it meant acknowledging that a child had been left in a quarantine facility for months without a care plan, which meant paperwork that nobody wanted to write. I sat in front of the work order for a long time. I thought about Piv watching me for 3 days before she came through the grill. I thought about the careful calculation in her eyes when she first dropped to the floor. I thought about the cloth she'd placed under the drip point, the precision of it, the unglamorous practicality of someone who understood that things require tending. I thought about the folded note on the shelf in SR12, with its slanting handwriting and its specific request. Keep her safe until someone comes who can take her somewhere better. I thought about the kind of man I was. I was a maintenance technician, good at my job, patient and methodical and honest about what the readings said. The readings said, "There is a child in this facility who should not be here and who will not survive 2 years of institutional indifference without damage." That was what the readings said. That was what honest documentation of the situation required me to acknowledge. The question was what to do about it. Then I made a decision that was not in my job description. I want to be precise about what I did and what I didn't do, because there's a version of this story where I'm braver than I was. I didn't break Piv out of the facility. That wasn't possible. The biological lockdown was enforced by automated systems, not human guards, and the decon protocols required a formal release authorization that I had no authority to issue. I couldn't open the external doors. I couldn't arrange a drone pickup that the health authority wouldn't immediately detect and flag. What I could do was this. I could write a report that said what it needed to say and left out what it didn't. My work order required me to assess the ventilation seals in the eastern wing, document the scope of the contamination breach, and prepare a formal report for the authority's legal and remediation teams. It did not, technically, require me to provide a comprehensive census of current facility residents. The facility's own automated systems tracked vital signs and location data for all residents. That was the authority's data, maintained by their systems, not mine to compile or report. My report documented the installation defect in precise technical detail. It documented the cross-contamination pathways. It documented the equipment faults I'd repaired, and the equipment faults I hadn't been able to repair with the tools available to me. It documented, in the section on facility population, the 2 remaining residents whose vital sign data I had confirmed as active in the authority's system. Vash, and by then, one other, a man named Cullen I hadn't met because he communicated only through his pod's written message interface. It did not document the non-classified resident who was not in the authority's vital sign monitoring system because she'd never been formally enrolled in it, because she wasn't a patient, because she'd been intake processed as an exposure contact and then lost in the administrative collapse of day 207 when the research director died and the paperwork stopped moving. There was no lie in the report. There was an omission. I've sat with the difference between those 2 things for a long time, and I've decided I can live with it. The secondary thing I did was this. I contacted, on my own time, from my personal communication unit rather than the facility's monitored systems, an organization called the Kethani Transit Council, which was a non-governmental body that handled diaspora welfare and resettlement services for Kethani individuals displaced by the various catastrophes the Verath Collective's expansion had generated over the previous decade. I told them I had located a Kethani miner who had been lost in the administrative collapse of a quarantine facility and who required extraction and resettlement once the facility's lockdown was resolved. I gave them Piv's intake date and the facility designation. They were not surprised. They told me they had several similar cases in their active file. They told me they had legal mechanisms in place for exactly this situation. They told me the lockdown resolution timeline I'd given them was workable. I said good. They asked me for the child's name. I said Piv, and then, because the intake file had a field for it and the field had been left blank, I said the family designation as best I could in Kethani, which I had looked up the previous evening on my personal unit, and which meant, approximately, the one who was kept. There was a pause on the line. The woman I was speaking to said, "Who gave her that designation?" I said I had. There was another pause. Then she said, "That's customary. It's what a Kethani caretaker gives a child they've taken responsibility for." She paused again. "Are you her caretaker?" I thought about Piv watching me fix the recycler. I thought about her appearing through the grill in the wall. I thought about her sitting beside me on the floor of the junction room while we were both quiet about Sorek. I said yes, until someone comes who can take her somewhere better. The woman said she'd be in touch. I had 42 days left on my work order. I want to tell you what those 42 days were, and I find I have trouble with the ordinary words for it. There was nothing dramatic about them. The facility ran. The air scrubbers ran. The water recycling membranes ran. I did my maintenance rounds and Piv did hers. She had, I discovered, her own maintenance rounds. A self-organized circuit of the crawlspace routes that she ran twice daily, checking, with the attentiveness of someone who understood intuitively that systems require attention, that nothing was making a sound it shouldn't. She started accompanying me on my rounds. Not all of them. She was cautious about level 1, where Supervisor Dast occasionally appeared at the partition, and I understood and didn't push. He was a man who did his job the way it was written and no further, and the first time I'd seen him through the partition glass, I'd clocked the kind of blank administrative efficiency in his eyes that tends to be incurious up to a point, and then very thorough past it. Piv had clocked it too, I suspect, long before I arrived. She'd been watching the people in this facility for months. She knew which ones were safe and which ones weren't, by whatever calculus small things used to make those assessments, and Dast was not one she wanted to be visible to. So level 1 was hers to avoid and mine to manage, and we operated on that understanding without discussing it. But level 2 and level 3 she knew better than I did. She knew which junction panels had stiff catches. She knew which airflow grills rattled at a certain pressure differential and which rattled for structural reasons. She knew the sound of the water recycler when it was running correctly and the slightly different sound it made when the secondary membrane needed flushing. She knew where the condensation gathered on cold pipes and dripped onto the junction room floor when the external temperature differential dropped below a certain threshold, and she had placed, with methodical precision, a folded cloth at the drip point to prevent the water from pooling on the electrical housing below. I found this cloth arrangement on my 3rd day of rounds with her and said nothing about it, because there was nothing to say. It was good maintenance practice. I replaced the cloth with a proper drainage diverter from my kit, and she watched me do it, and then she pointed at the place where I'd need to check the diverter every 4 days or it would clog with mineral deposit. She was right. I started explaining what I was doing as I worked. Not performing explanation, not talking down to her, not simplifying in a way that assumed ignorance. Just narrating the work the way I would to any second pair of hands. This fitting goes here. This pressure reading should be between these 2 numbers. When it goes above this line, it means this. When it goes below, it means that. She listened with the focused stillness of something that was very good at learning. And she asked questions the way someone who has been watching for a long time asks questions. Not from scratch, but from just behind the point of understanding, filling in the last gap. Her questions came in gestures and occasional sounds, and increasingly, in the Verath standard syllables she'd absorbed from the facility's audio log system and from Vash and Sarek and now from me. Not fluent, not even approaching fluent, but precise. She asked about the things that mattered and left out the things that didn't, which is a form of intelligence I've always respected more than the kind that fills all the space. There was an afternoon, I think it was around day 26 of my assignment, when Piv showed me something I would have missed on my own. We were in the far end of the level 2 eastern corridor, checking the junction seals I'd already documented for the report, and she stopped at a panel I'd cleared and marked as within acceptable range. She put her palm flat against the wall beside the panel. She held it there for a moment. Then she looked at me. I put my palm against the wall. The vibration was almost nothing. A faint irregularity in the airflow cadence coming through the duct behind the panel, not detectable in the pressure readings, because it was a frequency artifact rather than a volume differential, and the monitoring equipment filtered for volume. But it was there. And when I pulled the panel off and looked at the duct interior, I found a secondary seal that had partially sheared along one edge. Not enough to register as a contamination pathway yet, not enough to fail a visual inspection if you were moving quickly, but developing. Another 6 weeks and it would have been a breach. I replaced the seal and updated the report. I looked at Piv when I was done. She looked back at me. Her expression was the same considered neutrality she usually wore, but there was something around the edges of it that I had begun to learn to read, a quality of satisfaction that she didn't perform but didn't hide either. "Thank you," I said. She looked at the repaired seal. Then she looked at me and gave a single nod, the kind that means the matter is understood and we can move on. We moved on. Vash's condition progressed. I can't dress that up. The bloom was patient and it did what it did, and Vash knew it was doing it, and she dealt with that knowledge with the same quiet fury she'd applied to everything else in Kale 9, not raging at the walls, just refusing to pretend the walls weren't there. We spoke most days through her pod comm. She asked about Piv. I told her what I'd done, the transit council call, the designation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a voice that had some difficulty around the edges of it, "Good. That's the right thing." "She'll go somewhere good," I said. "I know she will," Vash said. "She found you, didn't she? She picked right." There were days when Vash wanted to talk about things that had nothing to do with the facility or the bloom or the administrative failures that had put her here. She talked about the freight routes she'd coordinated, the schedules, the cargo manifests, the particular satisfaction of a clean logistics chain running on time without drama. She talked about a settlement on the northern outpost where she'd grown up, and a mechanic there who had maintained the station's atmospheric processors for 30 years, and how the whole settlement had turned out the day he retired, because everyone understood, even if they'd never said it, that the clean air they'd been breathing for 3 decades was his work. She said she'd always thought about that. She said she thought about it now more than she used to. I understood what she meant. She asked me once, through the comm panel, whether I thought Piv remembered the person who'd made her room in SR-12. I said I thought she did. I said that in my experience, small things that have had reason to be careful about trust tend to remember very precisely who gave them reason to trust again. Vash was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. I'd like to be remembered for something useful." I said, "You kept her safe. That's useful." "We kept her safe," Vash said. "Sarek too, the 3 of us. We just did what we could from where we were." She paused. "Now it's yours to carry." I said I understood. We didn't talk about the fact that she was getting worse. We didn't need to. She knew I read the facility logs. She knew I noticed when her communication windows got shorter. We talked about systems and logistics and the particular satisfaction of work done correctly, and those conversations held something between us that didn't require nomming. Her last communication with me was a message through the pod's written interface, 3 lines, sent on the morning of my 33rd day. "Tell her I fixed the lamp in SR-12. I noticed it had a loose contact. I wanted her to have a room with a light that worked. Tell her she was not alone in there, not for 1 day of it." That's all. I read it several times. I saved it on my personal unit. I don't know that I ever found the right moment to tell Piv all of it, but I think she knew the parts that mattered. She'd watched the lamp in SR-12 the same way she watched the diagnostic gauges, with the attention of someone who knew what working properly looked like and was quietly grateful for it. On my 31st day, Piv brought me something. I was in the junction room running the morning diagnostics, and she appeared from the crawl space as she usually did, dropped through the grill, and crossed to me. She held out the doll, the one she'd been carrying since I first saw her, the one made from rolled bandage material and electrical wire. I looked at it, I looked at her. She pushed it toward me with both hands. "That's yours," I said. She shook her head. She pushed it toward me again, and her expression was the most complicated thing I'd ever seen on a face that's small, deliberate, and certain, and something underneath that I didn't have a word for, not yet. I took the doll. I held it carefully, the way you hold something that means more than it looks. She looked at me for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of the knotted medical tunic and produced a second doll, smaller than the first, newer looking, made from a different set of materials. She held it up. "You made that one," I said. She nodded. "For yourself?" She nodded again. "And you made the first one to give to me." She looked at the doll in my hands and then at me, and in the pale silver of her eyes something was settled. Whatever calculation she'd been running since the day she dropped through the grill, whatever 3-day assessment had preceded that decision, whatever ongoing audit of my reliability and decency she'd been conducting ever since, was complete. The books were closed. The doll was the receipt. I didn't know what to say. I said, "Thank you, Piv." She sat down beside the recycler and watched the diagnostic readouts. I sat down beside her. We watched the numbers together. The remaining days before Coordinator Soth arrived had a particular quality I find difficult to describe without making it sound smaller than it was. Nothing changed in the outward structure of our days. We still ran the maintenance rounds. We still sat in the junction room. Piv still appeared through the grill each morning and took the food from beside the recycler, and I still didn't watch her take it. And neither of us acknowledged the arrangement directly because it was an arrangement and not a performance. But something had shifted in the texture of the time. I was aware now that it was running out, and I think she was too, and we both operated on the understanding that the correct response to that was to use it well rather than mourn it in advance. So we worked. We went over every system on level 2 and level 3 that I had any legitimate reason to touch, and some that I stretched the mandate of my work order to include, and Piv's hands were on more and more of the repairs, not doing them unsupervised, not yet, but present, learning the sequence, building the memory of correct procedure that I knew from experience was the kind of knowledge that stays in the hands long after the context that taught it is gone. On day 38, I spent an afternoon in SR-12 with her, going through the room systems, the lamp, the dispensary unit, the ventilation grill, making sure everything was in the best order I could put it in for whoever might use the room after she'd gone. She helped. She handed me tools when I reached. She checked my seal work with 2 careful fingers, the way I'd shown her, feeling for the catch and the compression. When we were done, she looked around the room and then looked at the shelf, at the 2 dolls, at the folded note, at the warm yellow lamp burning steadily. "Vash fixed the lamp," I said. She was quiet. "Before I got here," I said. "She noticed the contact was loose and she fixed it. She wanted you to have a room with a light that worked." Piv looked at the lamp for a long time. Then she looked at the note on the shelf, and the expression on her face had something in it that I recognized as the adult form of an emotion she'd have to grow into fully, but was already carrying. The particular weight of knowing that people you didn't get to keep had loved you precisely and well. "She'll be remembered," I said. Piv nodded once. Then she picked up her doll and we went back to work. The Transit Council representative arrived on day 41, one day before my work order expired, via the same drone drop system that had brought me in. Her name was Coordinator Soth, and she was Kethani herself, which I hadn't known to expect, with the same gill ridge markings and the same particular quality of attention in her eyes. She came through the decon corridor and met me at the level 2 junction. "You have her," she said. "She has me," I said. "There's a distinction." Coordinator Soth looked at me for a moment. "How is she?" "Good," I said. "Better than she should be, given everything. She understands systems. She pays attention. She's going to be fine somewhere that isn't this." Soth nodded. "Her family situation, we've been working on it. There are extended family members in the second corridor settlements who were unaware of her location. They've been located. They want her." I said that was good. It's not a perfect solution, Soth said. The family is in a resettlement camp currently, still processing their own displacement. It won't be easy, but they know her. They have her name. Her full name, I said, or the designation I gave her. Both, Soth said. The family confirmed the designation is appropriate. They said it's exactly what they would have chosen. She paused. They asked me to thank whoever gave it to her. I said there was no need. We went down to level 3. Piv was in SR-12, sitting on the sleeping pad with both dolls in her lap, hers and the one she'd given me, which I'd brought back to her room and placed on the shelf beside the older doll. When I'd done that, she'd looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of an argument, and I'd said, "Keep it safe for me here. I'll know where it is." She'd thought about that for a moment and then appeared to accept the logic. She saw Soth and went very still. Soth crouched down to eye level and said something in Kethani, several syllables, low and careful. Piv listened. She glanced at me. I nodded. She looked back at Soth and said something in return. 2 syllables I recognized as her own name, and then another sound I didn't know. Soth's face changed. She said something quietly, and Piv said the sound again, more firmly. I said to Soth, "What is she saying?" Soth stood up slowly. Her expression was careful, in the way of someone managing something that wants to be larger than the room can hold. "She's giving you a designation," Soth said. "In Kethani custom, when a child in a protected period, meaning under the care of someone outside their family, wishes to formally acknowledge that caretaker, they give them a bond name. It's a relational term. It doesn't have a direct translation." She paused. The closest analog and standard would be something like, "the one who stayed to make the air right." I looked at Piv. She looked back at me with her still silver eyes and her composed expression, and the absolute certainty of someone who has done a careful thing and knows it is the correct thing. I said, "I'll take it." She nodded. Then she picked up her doll, her own, the newer one, and put it in the carry satchel that Soth had brought, and she stood up from the sleeping pad and she looked around SR-12 one more time. At the shelf, at the warm yellow lamp, at the folded note she'd shown me, which was still where I'd put it, neatly placed. She looked at me. I crouched down to her level. I said, "You're going somewhere good. The family they found, they know your name, both names." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in careful Varath standard, "You fix it." I said, "I try to." She looked at me for one more moment, the way she'd looked at the calibration gauges when she was learning what the numbers meant, and then she turned and walked to coordinator Soth and took the hand Soth offered, and they went down the corridor toward the decon lock. I sat on the sleeping pad for a while after they were gone. Then I got up and made sure the lamp was switched off and the door latched properly, and I went back to work. There were still 17 hours on my contract, and the North Junction pressure readings had been fluctuating for 2 days in a way I hadn't fully resolved. My formal report went to the Varath Health Authority on the morning of day 42. It said what it needed to say. There was an investigation afterward, not of me. Not directly, but of the installation defect and the administrative failures that had compounded it. Dorthan Environmental Systems paid a significant settlement. 3 health authority officials were formally censured for the management failures during the KL-9 research team's collapse. None of them were censured for the non-classified resident in Pod 7, because the non-classified resident in Pod 7 was not in my report, and the authority's own records had a gap in day 208 that nobody had ever bothered to look at carefully. I went back to maintenance work. Different facilities, different systems. I was good at my job. I thought about Piv. Not every day, I'm being honest with you, but regularly. I thought about the way she'd watched the diagnostic gauges. I thought about her self-organized maintenance circuit in the crawlspaces. I thought about the doll made from bandage material and wire, which I had kept, and which sat on the shelf above my workstation in every facility I was assigned to over the following years. I thought about being called the one who stayed to make the air right, and what it meant to be given a name by someone small who had thought about it carefully. I heard from Coordinator Soth once, about 14 months after KL9. A brief message, professional, the kind you send when you have an obligation to close a loop. The family resettlement had been completed. Piv was with her extended family in a new settlement on the second corridor outpost. She was in an education program. She was, Soth wrote, very good with technical systems and showed a particular aptitude for environmental management. I read that twice, then I wrote back and said thank you. 7 years passed. I won't compress them dishonestly. They were ordinary years, in the sense that maintenance work is ordinary, routine, and technical, and requiring the same careful attention in the 100th hour as in the first. I worked in 4 different facilities over that period. I trained 2 junior technicians. I wrote reports that said what they needed to say. I did not think about KL9 every day, but I thought about it enough, and I thought about Piv enough, and what I mostly thought was the thing you think when something has gone the way it was supposed to go, that it was enough to have been in the right place at the right time and to have done the work correctly. You don't get to follow every repaired SEAL home and see how it holds over the years. You do the job. You document the job. You move on to the next one and trust that it holds. The doll sat on the shelf above my workstation in every facility I was assigned to. I didn't make a ceremony of it. It was just there, the way a tool you don't need every day is still part of the kit, present, accounted for, available. I was assigned to a facility on the outer ring of the Dreneth orbital platform, a water treatment station, old infrastructure, the kind of job that comes to technicians who are reliable and experienced and don't require a great deal of supervision. I liked it. The systems were complex and interesting, and the platform had a long view of the station grid below, which I found I never got tired of watching in the way you never get tired of watching something that works the way it's supposed to. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd month of that assignment, there was a knock on the door of the maintenance bay. I said, "Come in." The door opened, and a young woman stepped through it. She was Kethani, amber gold skin, gill ridge markings in blue-green iridescent lines along her jaw, pale silver-white eyes. She was taller than she'd been, which was to be expected, and she wore the uniform of a Dreneth platform facilities trainee, which was blue-gray and new-looking and suited her. She was carrying a toolbox. She looked at my workstation, at the shelf above it, at the doll. Then she looked at me. I said, "You found me." She said, "You're not hard to find. You're always where the systems need fixing." Her Vereth standard was fluent now, precise and unhurried, with a quality to it that I recognized as specifically her, the same focused economy she'd had at 7 or 8 years old in the crawl spaces of KL9. Some things change. The essential frequency doesn't. She crossed the bay, put her toolbox on the work table, and looked at the diagnostic panel I'd been running. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the readings. Then she pointed at a number in the lower right quadrant. "That pressure differential has been creeping for 3 days," I said. "I haven't isolated the source yet." She nodded. She picked up a calibration tool, the same type, it happened, as the one she'd watched me use in the level 3 junction room of KL9 7 years ago. "Show me the secondary loop schematic," she said. I pulled it up on the panel. She studied it the way she'd always studied things, from the outside in, starting with the overall logic and working toward the specific fault, not rushing, not filling the quiet with commentary. I recognized the quality of her attention the same way I'd recognized her frequency when she first appeared through the grill. Some things don't change. They deepen and widen, but the essential signal is the same one. She pointed to a junction. "There," she said, "the gasket on the secondary input is failing. It'll present as a pressure differential before it shows as a flow irregularity. You need to replace the gasket." I looked at the junction she'd indicated. I looked at the readings. She was right. Completely and quickly right, in the way of someone who'd been putting their hands on systems long enough to develop the instinct that runs ahead of the theory. I said, "When did you decide to go into facilities maintenance?" She was already opening the access panel for the junction. She looked over her shoulder at me, and in her pale silver eyes there was something that was amused and certain in equal measure. "When I was very young," she said, "I watched someone do it well." She turned back to the access panel. It seemed like a good use of a life. I sat down on the worktable stool. I watched her hands on the calibration tool, sure, unhurried, reading the system the way she'd always read things, from just behind the point of understanding, and then closing the last gap with complete precision. "You didn't have to come find me," I said. "No," she said. She removed the worn gasket and set it aside and reached for the replacement from her toolbox. "I know." She fitted the replacement gasket. She reran the seal check. The pressure differential evened out on the panel. "Good catch," I said. She stood up and looked at the panel for a moment. Then she looked at me, and whatever was in her face had the same quality as the doll, deliberate and certain, and something underneath it that I didn't have a word for, though I'd thought about it for 7 years and was beginning to think the word for it was something that didn't exist in Verath standard and would have to be looked up. "You stayed," she said. "In the dark facility, you stayed and made the air right." I said I fixed what needed fixing. She was quiet for a moment. "When I was in SR-12 before you came, the air quality had been getting worse for weeks. I knew what the readings meant. I knew eventually it would cross the threshold." She paused. "I didn't know anyone was going to come." I didn't say anything. "And then I heard you," she said, "working in the junction room, getting it back in range." The water treatment station hummed around us. Outside the viewport, the Dreneth platform grid spread its lights against the dark, each point a system running the way it was supposed to. And beyond it, the slow arc of orbital transit lanes, and further still the corridor settlements, and all of it dependent on the unglamorous work of people who showed up to the maintenance bay and stayed until the pressure differential was resolved. "I'm glad you heard me," I said. Piv looked at the panel, at the even readings, at the work completed. Then she reached into the pocket of her trainee uniform and set something on the worktable beside me. A doll, small, made from rolled cloth and wire, new but made with care, the construction more skillful than the original but recognizably the same hand. "I thought," she said, "you might want yours back, since I'm here now, since I can keep an eye on it." I picked it up. I looked at it for a moment. It was lighter than I remembered and heavier than it looked, the way things always are when they mean more than their materials. The construction was more skilled than the original, the wire work cleaner, the cloth tighter, the proportions more deliberate, but it had the same essential shape. The same hand, 7 years later, knowing what it was doing. "All right," I said. She picked up her toolbox. She looked at the workstation, at the panel, at the list of maintenance tasks I had queued for the afternoon. "What's next?" she said. I handed her the task list. She read it, nodded once, and got to work. I sat on the stool and watched her, and the platform hummed, and the lights of the corridor grid held steady in the dark, and the air in the maintenance bay was exactly where it was supposed to be.